On 100.9 WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Evidence of Design. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Matt Treadwell.
Good morning.
This is our 10th episode of Evidence of Design, folks, and we are here with you live today on air from WXIR Studios in Rochester, New York. We come to you live on Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. We weren't with you the past 2 weekends live, but we are here with you now, and we are definitely happy to be here on this somewhat rainy and cloudy day in Rochester, but not too bad. We had some pretty good weather this week, and it feels pretty nice. You can listen to our past shows on YouTube by searching for the Evidence of Design channel, and you can email us throughout the show at evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. Also, we'd love to have an open discussion, so please do call in today at 585-219-8889. If you have a question or thought that you'd like to contribute to the conversation, we would love to hear it. Now, on today's episode, we're continuing discussion from last week on neoliberalism, which is the focus point of this show. As a reminder, neoliberalism is the political and economic belief that a free market, a small government, and low social spending are the best ways to run society. And neoliberal policies have really been implemented on both sides of the political aisle in the United States for the past 40 years. It is our view that neoliberal policies have produced both dangerous and dramatic income and wealth inequality in America. And those have produced divisions of social class which undermine democratic ideals and social justice. So that's really the focal point of this show, is to kind of investigate what neoliberalism is and how our policies and governments, both local and nationally, are producing certain things that can exacerbate inequality, mainly in social class, but also definitely manifesting in other areas of our lives, such as race and gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity. So today's show, we're going to continue to contextualize neoliberalism with the goal of making it clear, and we'll spend a considerable amount of time delving into income and wealth inequality in America. We'll look at what is income and wealth inequality, where it comes from, what are the effects of it? And lastly, please don't forget to email us throughout the show, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com, or give us a call, 585-219-8889. Matt, let's take it away.
Someone was watching over it before it was, as if response was based on fact, providing, deciding it was soon there, square to it, face to it was not there.
Matt, who was that?
That was Wire with the song The 15th.
Has Wire been around for a long time?
They have, since the 70s.
What kind of music do they do?
Post-punk.
Post-punk. I'm pretty proud that I got that whole shindig right there correctly. Usually I have trouble asking what a song is.
Yeah, well, you made it very simple for yourself. Who did that?
Who did that? It's a pretty universal way to come across. Who was the author of that song? Yeah, I think it doesn't work so well. Well, folks, again, you listen to Evidence of Design. Let's talk a little bit about income and wealth inequality in the United States. It's really the focal point of what we'd like to talk about. We think that income and wealth inequality is so important, and it's often under-discussed. We all kind of feel income and wealth inequality. We can look around and we see it. And because all of us occupy a class position, even if we don't want to acknowledge it in the United States, like all of us can feel the effects of social class because all of us have to deal with money. I think that it gives all of us sort of a credibility to be able to talk about it, but it's sort of a superficial credibility, and we often don't get into it as much as possible because social class is sort of avoided, it's negated and disguised in America, and I think that our culture does a pretty poor job of talking about class, and class ultimately, I think, has a really profound impact on every aspect of our life, really. And neoliberalism, this political and economic belief that we should have a small government and we should have a free market and sort of a laissez-faire, a hands-off society so that individual people can just be their own entrepreneurs and business people and capitalists. That whole belief has arguably produced rampant income and wealth inequality in this country, and that's why I think we see so much sort of tumultuous politics nowadays, not just with Donald Trump, but absolutely he's sort of a side effect of income and wealth inequality. And if you've heard in past shows, I think that the 2016 presidential election turned out the way that it did because there was such income and wealth inequality to begin with, and it created politicians like Donald Trump who are only possible because of that inequality. But we'd love to delve deeper into that. And boy, Matt, I'm feeling a little sick, folks.
Yeah,
So,
well, we're both sick, so.
yeah, thankfully through the radio, though, safe from germs. But in this room, a little pathogenic right now. We'll make it out. So last week we went into the history of neoliberalism, and we keep saying the past 40 years because really in the 1970s and the 1980s, oftentimes with Ronald Reagan in the United States as the president and Margaret Thatcher as the prime minister in the UK, neoliberal policies really became sort of instantiated, manifested in politics. It was a general conservatization of politics in both the US and the UK, meaning that the entire political spectrum kind of shifted to the right. There's a book by Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson. They're political scientists, and it's called The Rise of Winner-Take-All Politics: Public Policy, Political Organization, and the Precipitous Rise in Top Incomes in the United States. That's like the longest title ever, but it's a 2010 book. It's quite great, and they write that the polarization of the two parties that we've seen, both Democrat and Republican, has been driven more by the move of the Republican Party to the right than the movement of the Democratic Party to the left. Therefore, overall, the shifting balance of partisan politics in the United States has gone to the right, so we've been conservatized, despite the fact that there's little evidence that the American public has conservatized themselves. Meaning, you would think that if the American people in a democracy, all 325 million of us, all of a sudden had more conservative ideas, then it would be natural that our parties would reflect that conservatization. But these authors argue, Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, that the American public hasn't really become more conservative. It's just that the politics, the sort of popular party politics, has become more conservative. And I'm not sure if they actually invoke the term neoliberalism, but I would argue that that would be a useful framework to say why we've become more conservative, because both parties have generally aligned themselves on smaller government, lower taxation, arguably stricter social safety nets, and things of that nature. So let us define, we talk a lot about where is there income and wealth inequality in the United States. Let's talk a little bit about some facts and figures, and I know we've gave some facts and figures out in the past couple episodes. But Matt, if someone says to you inequality, like just the blanket term inequality, what do you think of?
I think about pay gaps, for example, in terms of different demographics. So, we often hear that women make something like 79 cents to every man's dollar or something like that. And the same is true for black men versus white men. It's 89 cents to every white man's dollar. I'm not quoting anything specific there. I don't know if those numbers are correct, but it is often brought up that the pay gap. And then just economic opportunities, educational opportunities for people, where you live, what your leisure is like.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. So you're bringing up like interracial inequality. You're bringing up gender inequality. You're bringing up sort of inequality of opportunity through things like education, and all of those forms of inequality you're mentioning are economically based, like pay gaps. So when we talk about inequality, it can be defined in so many different ways, and of course, inequality doesn't have to deal with money at all. But the type of inequality we're talking about today is income and wealth inequality. So it has to do with finances. But of course, I'd like for everyone listening to keep in the sort of their back pocket that these things also manifest, as you just mentioned, Matt, in race, in class. Sorry, not class, because we're talking about expressly, but in gender, and also between nations, so internationally. We're mainly going to be talking about intranationally today, so just within the United States, but it's also internationally as well. And, if someone says income and wealth inequality, do you, Matt, know kind of what the differences are there, like income and wealth? Like what income is probably easier?
I guess the distinction that I would make is that income is just, your salary or whatever it is you bring home. And then wealth is like your assets or what you own.
Yeah. Yeah. So income is usually kind of what are you getting as a result of your labor. So traditionally, if you have to work for a living, which most people do, then your income is your labor. And for a lot of people, that is their only source of financial assets is income. So you work, and then that's the money you get, and that is what you are worth, in a market-based society.
I think you made the point last week that some people have assets like a home or a car, but if you sell that home or car, then you don't have another home or car to sell or own or live in or drive.
Yeah. Yeah, so even if you have the privilege, which I hope people do, to own home, at least in our market-based society, owning a home helps to increase your wealth and all the rest of it. But of course, maybe that's tied into your wealth. But what happens if you have to sell your home and sell your car? Well, you'll have more disposable money, but then you don't have a home or car anymore. So it sounds super blatantly obvious, but like it's really important when you just put the problem with money is you just put a number value on something, and it doesn't mean anything because money is sort of a socially constructed concept. It doesn't mean anything. Money has zero value outside of itself, and so it's important to sort of define these obvious things because I think that they become invisible and you lose sight of it. And you especially have to define it with wealth because you just said, Matt, that wealth is kind of your assets, and so wealth is usually stuff like we just said, your car and your house or whatever. But more importantly, and what we're going to be talking about today, and when we talk about neoliberalism, wealth is oftentimes financial wealth in terms of like stocks and bonds and assets and derivatives and all those sort of really complicated things that maybe everyday folks don't know much about, not because of their ignorance, but because they don't have access to them. So I'm not sure how many listeners out there own stocks or have investments. Arguably, what is most rewarding in our economy today are those things, our financial investments, because wages by and large have not increased for the past 40 years. Ever since these neoliberal policies have started to be implemented, inflation goes up, so the purchasing value of our dollar bill goes down. So in theory, incomes should go up as well for your labor. But wages, by and large, have not increased all that much for the past 40 years. What has increased, though, exponentially, phenomenally, extraordinarily, is financial wealth. Meaning, if you are able to invest money, you get a lot of money off of that investment. So oftentimes you talk about this thing called capital, capital, C-A-P-I-T-A-L. You hear that a lot when you talk about economics, and capital is kind of usually synonymous with financial wealth. So you have capital, it means you're kind of able to move money around a lot, and your financial investments are a form of capital. And nowadays, that form of capital is super powerful, and it's more powerful than ever before. And that's kind of at the heart of what we're talking about. Because if most Americans only have income and not necessarily really strong capital or wealth, and then if the economic system is rewarding capital and wealth and not rewarding income, you get extraordinary inequality. Those who own the capital and the wealth get more and more returns on their investments, while those who just have income to rely on aren't able to make ends meet. And that's kind of at the heart of what we're talking about today is the differences between income and wealth and what those inequalities are and how they manifest, and ultimately how our public policies have created these things. None of what we're talking about happens by accident. It's not magical. It's not the laissez-faire, invisible hand of some divine market god. This stuff happens because we as humans kind of create it. So one of the so again, measuring inequality though, there's a number of different ways to do it, and one of the ways is called the Gini coefficient. And Matt, if someone asked you how unequal is the U.S., like where would you say out of, so there's like 180-ish countries in the world. If there's out of 180-ish countries, do you think the U.S. is more equal or more unequal economically compared to other countries in the world?
I would guess that in terms of Western nations, such as Canada and the European Union, the U.S. ranks lower than most of those.
So the U.S. is more unequal than European Western nations?
Yes.
Mm. What about non-European nations? Do you think they're comparable, or is that why you're kind of hesitating about them?
I think that there is a lot of, the U.S. is the wealthiest nation in the world.
Mm-hmm. In the history of the world.
And so I don't think we're at the bottom, but I do think that we are. I still think there is like a lot of opportunity in America and everything, but I do think that, so I don't think we're at the bottom. I don't think we're, I kind of know because I have access to the notes that we did for this.
Sure.
But yeah, in the middle.
In the middle, yeah. If folks are just joining us, you are listening to Evidence of Design here at 100.9 FM WXIR. We're talking today about income and wealth inequality in the United States and how that's been produced by neoliberal policies, which is mainly making the government smaller and making our society more reliant upon a free market as opposed to regulation or government intervention, and really advocating for a public collective good. So instead of public collective goods, we are more increasingly reliant on privatization. And we're talking about how privatization and other neoliberal policies produce income and wealth inequality. And so we're kind of talking about how you measure income and wealth inequality, and one of those ways is the Gini coefficient. That's Gini, and that Gini coefficient is it's a fancy economic tool that you can use. It's really not that fancy, folks. It's a ratio. So it's a ratio used to measure income and wealth inequality in a country. And the ratio basically compares perfect equality in a country versus the actual level of inequality. So if you picture a graph in your mind, like a y-axis and an x-axis, and then you have a y equals x line, so that is the 45-degree line that increases linearly. So it's just picture that in your mind. Math class might be a long time ago. It might be traumatizing. It is for me too. But that is a line of perfect equality, meaning if you have 30% of your population, they should own 30% of the total national wealth or income. If you have 50% of your population, they should own 15% of the wealth and income, and so on. So it's directly proportional to the level of people, the number of people, and then their amount of income. Of course, though, most societies don't operate that way, and especially not the United States, and it depends. So oftentimes you get, let's say, the top 10% of the population owning maybe 25% of all the nation's income or wealth. And that is sort of more reality of most modern societies. And the Gini coefficient essentially just gives a number to that level of inequality. So if you go on something like the CIA World Factbook, it's usually a pretty good resource to get a number of different facts and figures. The CIA World Factbook, the U.S. is ranked with a Gini coefficient of 45. Now, the Gini coefficient is only ever between 0 and 1. And if the Gini coefficient is 1, it means one person controls all of the wealth in the nation. And if the Gini coefficient is 0, it means the wealth is perfectly distributed to everyone. And now the Gini coefficient in the U.S. is about 45, so 0.45, and doesn't matter all that much. But what it means is once you compare that to other countries, the U.S. ranks as the 41st most unequal country out of 156 countries. So, Matt, you said it was kind of right in the middle. And
I was wrong.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. The U.S. is a little more unequal than right in the middle. So the U.S. is actually more unequal than most other countries. But then it becomes really, really shocking when you compare what other countries have similar levels of inequality as the U.S. So the countries with the countries that have slightly more equal economically societies than us are Cameroon, Guyana, Thailand, Iran, and the Philippines. So those nations have slightly more economically equal societies, and the countries with slightly more economically unequal societies are Peru, Jamaica, Mozambique, Singapore, and Saudi Arabia. Now, any of those countries I just mentioned, Matt, I would imagine the average American wouldn't think that the U.S. is similar to those nations. What do you think?
I would think that the average U.S. American might not even have a conception of what those other countries are like.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a great point. Where they're located and what their cultures and societies are like. Yeah, there's always a real danger to making international comparisons because obviously every society is different. But if you kind of go with the flow here and you say, well, we can in every single nation today, because every single nation sort of participates in the international global economy and uses money and distributes it in at least somewhat vaguely similar ways. Then this kind of comes out when it says, well, the U.S. is kind of economically equal as Mozambique and Thailand, which might be shocking to some folks. Where those nations that you mentioned, Matt, Western Europe, we thought the U.S. might be somewhat less economically equal than Western Europe. In fact, the U.S. is actually a lot more economically unequal than many of the nations in Western Europe. Again, out of 156 countries that the CIA World Factbook provides Gini coefficients for, Germany was 142, France was 135, the UK was 116, and again, the U.S. ranks 41, so it's quite far away. So even folks who think maybe that what countries are most similar to the U.S., Western Europe, those countries tend to be a lot more economically equal than the U.S. They're usually a lot more progressive and liberal in terms of how they structure their economies and social safety nets, whereas the U.S. is a lot more free market and privatized.
Less regulated.
Yeah, deregulated, less regulated, absolutely. So folks, I hope that provides a little bit of context. There's so many different ways you can get into the numbers and facts and figures here, but the Gini coefficient is one of them. The Gini coefficient shows us that the U.S. has been more unequal over time. In 1970, when arguably you started to see neoliberal policies instantiated, the U.S.'s Gini coefficient was 35, meaning it was more equal. And if the U.S. Yep. So back in 1970, the coefficient ranked at 0.35.
Okay, I understand now.
Yeah, the closer you are to 0, the more equal you are.
Yeah.
Closer you are to 1, the more unequal. So back in 1970, it was 0.35. If the U.S. ranked at that today, it would be the 98th most unequal country as opposed to the 41st most unequal country.
Much closer to the UK.
Yeah, much closer to the other Western European nations, which we're not saying those are the pinnacle nations that we should all strive to be like, but at least their income is distributed more evenly across the entire population. But there's way more facts and figures out there, and let's just breeze through real fast. And these come from a number of different sources you can find out there. In a book by an economist, Jeffrey Sachs, in 2012, The Price of Civilization, he writes that the wealthiest 1% of American households have more net worth than the bottom 90%. And you may have heard these maybe on Facebook or see little sort of memes and GIFs of just how concentrated wealth is for the wealthiest individuals. The wealthiest 1% of American households have more net worth than the bottom 90%. Emmanuel Saez, who is one of the world's leading economists, in 2016 he wrote a paper called Striking It Richer, and he wrote that the top 1% of income earners captured 52% of all economic growth between 1993 and 2015. So the past 2 decades, the top 1% of income earners captured the majority of all economic growth. And then there's a whole bunch of facts and figures from an organization called the Economic Policy Institute. And just for a few, the top 1% of income earners captured 60% of all income growth between 1979 and 2007. So again, a very small minority of people capturing the majority of economic growth. And ultimately, the top even, you can slice this even smaller, and that's what a lot of research has been doing the past almost a decade now, is slicing even the top incomes smaller and smaller. We used to focus on like the top 25%, then 10%, 1%. Now we're really looking at the 0.1%. The top 0.1% of income earners captured 35% of all income growth, while the bottom 90% captured only 8.6%. So how do you measure all this? I mean, there's a number of different ways, but arguably income tax returns are a great way to do so. So before governments had income tax returns, it was really hard to measure people's wealth because you had no reason to sort of disclose all of that information. With the income tax return that was in the U.S. in like 1913, all of a sudden you sort of had to disclose your income. And that has actually been beneficial, not only because we need taxes to pay for public services, but because now it provides a level of public transparency.
We have a way to keep track of all this.
Absolutely. And using income tax returns, now we have almost a century, more than a century's worth of data of people's incomes. And that's really been the way that we're able to track sort of how income and wealth is sort of distributed. The reality is a lot more complicated than that, and that was a very sort of brief answer, but it kind of provides a little picture. How about that CEO to worker pay ratio, Matt?
What would you like to know, Jason?
Well,
are there some years that you're specifically interested in?
Well,
because I have exactly two for you.
Have you heard, like, is that a thing? I mean, do you think most listeners would get the idea that CEOs are making a lot of money nowadays? I mean, is that a thing?
I feel, as somebody who doesn't study this to anywhere near the degree that you do, but is still relatively engaged in terms of news media, that's something that I hear about a lot.
Mm-hmm. When did you start hearing about that? I mean, I know that you sort of come into your own public consciousness as you get older, but...
Right. I would say probably around the time I started paying attention to the news more, which was in college.
Mm. Yeah, so relatively recently-ish.
Yes.
And, also, I'm not sure why I ask this, because I'm not sure how much this is kind of like known by people. Like, to me, this is the water. Like, I'm in the water, and I know there's a lot of inequality, and that's kind of what I study. Mm-hmm. But I wonder for folks who have 3 billion other things to do with their lives, rightfully so, whether or not this stuff sort of matters, or whether or not people know about it. And I'm really curious about that stuff. So I always hesitate, and I never know how many numbers to go through and whether numbers paint the picture. Because again, as I started out the show, we all get income and wealth inequality because we're all classed individuals. You can drive down the road and see high-rise projects and also sort of dilapidated homes. Rochester is unfortunately a very economically unequal city, and it mirrors what has happened to so many other. I don't know if post-industrial is the right word. That's the way I think of them. When, the industry in cities, especially around the Rust Belt and upstate New York, kind of left and collapsed. The post-industrial cities have the classic sort of bullseye shape of economic unequalness and also racial unequalness. And those came about ultimately mainly because of policies that happened through the government. And so I think we all see that, but I don't know if we know to the extent of what that occurs like. So yeah, I've heard too, the CEO to worker rape. The CEOs are extraordinarily compensated now for their work. Back in 1965, according to the Economic Policy Institute, CEOs made 20 times what one of their workers made.
So $20 for every dollar that a worker made.
Right. 2014, CEOs made 303 times what one of their workers made. So you would need 303 workers to make as much of what one CEO made.
In fact, I read a article just the other day, yesterday, in fact, where a man by the name of Les Leopold suggested that it was even higher and that it was something like 800 dollars to every $1 made by workers.
Yeah, and it depends on whether you're talking about income or wealth. I think that the figures I just cited, I always want to be honest with people. I think the figures I just cited, the CEO to worker pay ratio, was income. So this is what they get on their paychecks. I think that what that Les Leopold was talking about with that 800 to 1 is
stocks.
Perhaps like wealth. I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Because that is really important. And we can go into this, Matt, but I think that author writes, and also other authors write, that a big problem with inequality nowadays is not necessarily with income, because again, everyone's incomes have essentially been flat for the past 40 years. The problem is wealth. And CEOs now are getting a lot of their compensation for their work through stock buybacks and other dividends. So they're able to buy stocks in their own company that they're CEO of, and that becomes part of their income. And that's how they get exorbitantly wealthy.
Would it be fair to say that the money made through that process, through the acquisition of stocks, is much more difficult to track than in terms of income? As like Matt, you said, we've been able to track people's income since like the early 1900s.
Yeah, that's a huge point, and I hope I can capture this in terms of. So there is a level of invisibility to all of this. The more wealthy you are, you arguably have more ways to hide your wealth. You can use creative means such as offshore accounts and companies. We've talked about those before on this show, to sort of funnel wealth and hide it so it's not in your name.
Through a law firm, maybe?
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not sure what you're referring to. But there are definitely creative ways out there that you can hide income and wealth. And again, with income tax, like I'm not sure how that works in terms of how much your assets through stocks and all that have to be disclosed on your income. But there's definitely, like, for example, you don't have to pay an income tax if you are homeless, So in theory, inequality is actually oftentimes worse than it's reported, in my opinion, because our system is not capturing the most destitute people. And it's also not capturing the highest amounts of wealth of the wealthiest people, because the wealthiest people are hiding a lot of their wealth, and the poorest people aren't being accounted for because the system doesn't care about them to begin with.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So the numbers, in fact, do not accurately reflect our reality. It's actually much worse than they might suggest.
That's my opinion. Again, we could have long-term in-depth discussions on where these numbers come from, and I think that's deserved. Like, I think you should always be really careful when you cite quantitative numbers, because it's really easy to sort of construct false realities with them.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, my belief is that the numbers are scarier than they even show. Because again, it's only as good as our systems are that we track them. And yeah, the wealthy, thanks to policies passed by our government in cahoots with the wealthy, in my opinion, make it easier to hide that wealth. And of course, if you are homeless or you don't work, then you're not getting phone calls and surveys. If people distribute surveys via phone calls to homes and you don't have a home, you don't count as the sample. You're not in the sample size. So that becomes a really problematic, especially in a city like Rochester where we have a homeless population. They become invisible in the policies of the government, and therefore when politicians make decisions, they might not ever think about homeless individuals because they don't appear in the data they're looking at.
That's a vicious cycle. It just reinforces itself over and over and over again.
Yeah. And so, folks, I think I'm losing I might just be miming to you soon because I'm losing my voice here, but Matt and I are a little bit ill here. But you're listening to 100.9 FM on WXIR. This is Evidence of Design, and we're talking about neoliberalism today. Again, folks, we'd love to have you email us, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. We'd love to read your questions, comments, thoughts on air. And you can always give us a call, 585-219-8889. We're talking about income and wealth inequality in the United States, and towards the end we're going to really get into sort of the effects of the income and wealth inequality, though we've already been hitting on a number of them. You've talked about how income and wealth inequality is measured through things such as the Gini coefficient. We've talked about how the income tax was used to really, for the first time, provide longitudinal data, so long-term data that we can use to make people's income and wealth more transparent. And then we talked about a number of other facts and figures from different authors like Emmanuel Saez, Jeffrey Sachs, and institutions like the Economic Policy Institute, who have done a lot of research and work to really track and measure and define levels of inequality. And all these different facts and figures point to, for whatever reason, in the past 40 years, there's a top percentage of our population that is getting more and more income and wealth, and the vast majority of the population is getting less and less of it, or at least proportionally. So you have what's called the hollowing out of the middle class. The middle class gets smaller as the wealthiest actually grow. So we're getting more wealthy people, actually, which some would argue is good. We're getting more wealthy people, but we're also getting more impoverished people as well. And, arguably you want a strong middle class in a democratic society and any capitalist society, because the middle class is the backbone of the economy and is sort of the fluidity through which interclass mobility should happen through a middle class. It's very hard to go from just the rock bottom lower class to the highest upper class. But again, should we have classes at all? That's a discussion for a different a different show. One last sort of defining thing I'd like to talk about is taxes, and this has been a really important phenomenon in the growth of inequality in the past 40 or so years, and especially related to neoliberalism, again, which is a political and economic belief that we should have a smaller government and that society should be run more by a laissez-faire free market economic system. An example of that, having a smaller government and making it easier for corporations to have more power, is by reducing taxes. So, of course, in December of 2017, not all that long ago, the Republican-controlled Congress and President Trump signed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Tax Cut Act, which reduced corporate tax rate. I believe these facts and figures are correct, folks. It reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. It did that indefinitely. However, it did not cut the income taxes on folks indefinitely. I believe that expires in 2025. So our government made it so that corporations now will pay 21% maximally on their taxes indefinitely, and then for us, you and me, listeners out there who are individuals, well, we have nice tax cuts only until 2025 when it expires. It's also worth pointing out that the Congressional Budget Office and the Committee on Taxation found that this tax cut would increase the federal deficit by about $1.45 trillion over the next decade. And, of course, how the government makes money is through taxation. And if the government is not taxing, then the government has less money. And then we have less social support services like money for education, police, roads, infrastructure. But who does
Social
get
Security?
Social Security.
Healthcare.
Yeah, Medicaid and Medicare.
I would like to bring up something real quick.
Please do.
I thought this was an interesting point. Again, in the article I was reading yesterday with Les Leopold, and he described a conversation he'd had with a Danish friend of his, and he said that I think it was Danish, and it was a Nordic European country, and he said that this friend of his pays something like 50% of his income in taxes, but that his friend didn't feel like he had anything to complain about because he felt like he was getting his money's worth for that. Like, they have a very strong healthcare system, healthcare for everybody, single payer, I believe. Very good schools, well-maintained infrastructure. And I guess the point that I wanted to bring up in all of this is that Les Leopold argued that a lot of people in America complain about their taxes because he felt that they felt like they weren't getting anything for them. And so I thought that was an interesting perspective and one that I hadn't previously considered. Because every time I hear somebody complaining about taxes, it's usually just because they don't want to pay them. But it's not, I don't know that they necessarily take it to the next level or the degree to which it's like, well, I'm not getting anything back for them.
Yeah, I think that we do a very poor job as a society of really explaining the benefits of collectivism, of social unity, and looking out for the people. I think that we used to do a better job of that in America, and of course we are a culture that relies very much on individualism, rugged individualism, and I think we do a poor job collectively of defining like what our policies are that help each other out. For example, if you own a home, owning a home is subsidized by the government. If you own a home, you can deduct, your mortgage or whatever, your interest on your mortgage through your taxes. That is a direct result of the government of the United States subsidizing your social class. If you are wealthy enough to own a home, you pay less in taxes. Therefore, you are not supporting other individuals because you're not paying taxes on your home. So you're not paying taxes, which can go help other people, which might help them buy a home. Now, don't get all angry on me and say, well, owning a home is an American right and private property, and owning a home is expensive, and owning a home is good because it increases your wealth, and the government should be helping individuals own homes and home ownership. And I completely agree with that. Yeah, we should absolutely get people into homes that they can own because it does increase their wealth. But I would just want people to think about all the little ways that our society is helping or inhibiting certain social classes of people.
Right. I think something to consider is that I've had conversations with a few people, I won't name who, but they've said things like, it would be nice, if things could be different, if we could have like single payer, if we could have healthcare for everybody, if we did have, free higher education, for example, in public colleges, and if we didn't have to pay such high deductibles on like our medical expenses, for example, but we can't do that. Well, I mean, we can because there are other places that do, and so if we want things to be better, we first have to believe that they can be, and then decide to pursue them. Yeah.
And if we did a X percentage tax on the wealthiest 1% of individuals, we tax income, but we don't really tax wealth in the United States. Why do we have an income tax but not a wealth tax?
The only thing I can think of is estate taxes.
Right. Yeah, there are estate taxes, and a lot of those have been cut, to my knowledge, of the recent tax plan that we're just talking about. So by and large, all of these small things come together to a much larger picture, and that is neoliberalism. So all these smaller, seemingly isolated incidents, like, oh, here's this sort of innocuous tax plan passed to make it so that we can save more money and have more spending money in our pockets. And also, yeah, they cut the estate tax. All of these small things come to be a much larger narrative over 40 years of our lives where the government is incentivizing the accumulation of wealth for smaller people, for smaller populations of people. So when the government cuts the estate tax, that is benefiting a vast minority of people who are wealthy enough to have that much money for them to even qualify to be taxed in the first place. And when that stuff happens, that is part of a much larger narrative of our society subsidizing wealthier individuals at the expense of poorer people. And there's a lot of people out there who would argue that our society is engineered to extract wealth from the poor to give it to the wealthy, and that's called accumulation by dispossession. Critical geographer David Harvey writes a lot about that fancy term, accumulation by dispossession. So usually in economic growth, the idea is that a rising tide lifts all boats. So as our economy grows, everyone reaps the prosperity of that. Arguably, especially in the past 40 or so years, when our economy has grown, it's not so much because everyone has benefited from it. It's because the wealthier has extracted whatever growth there is from poorer people. And so they're dispossessing the accumulation of wealth from others. And, there's a lot you can go into that. But I think that accumulation by dispossession happens a lot through things like tax cuts. and spending less on social safety nets. And if you look at the top and bottom marginal tax rates, so again, the income tax was established federally in 1913. If you look at the top and bottom marginal tax rates for the past more than a century, in around, let's say, before or after World War II, the wealthiest individuals, our highest top marginal taxation rate was over 90%, which sounds insane. Like nowadays, that would be unheard of because, folks, if you don't know, these tax rates that I have, I apologize, they're before this tax cut. I don't know where the top and marginal tax rates are from the top of my head right now. This is in 2016 before the tax cuts came into effect. The top marginal tax rate was around 35%. The bottom marginal tax rate was around 8%, if I have those figures correct. So nowadays, we as a society have sort of come together and said, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense for the wealthiest individuals to be taxed by 35% of their income. That wasn't always the case, and actually for the vast majority, the vast history of taxation in the U.S., the wealthiest individuals were taxed much, much larger of their shares of income.
Upwards of 90%.
Upwards of 90%. Now, it's worth noting that those high times of taxation were around wars. So World War I, Great Depression, World War II, when our system was in very much shock. But I just want to point out that taxing people higher is not unheard of.
Yeah,
we've done it. And we stopped doing it. There's a precedent. And we stopped doing it really when Ronald Reagan historically famously slashed tax cuts. And the rhetoric behind that was that we need to free up some money. Taxation, the government is inefficient and ineffective, and that the government spends money poorly, and that the best way to grow our economy is to leave it in the hands of people. And
those people will use that wealth, that surplus wealth, and reinvest it into our communities, our schools, our social welfare programs.
Mm-hmm. And the argument goes, when those people, just like you said, Matt, can use that money to spend it where it needs to, in the rational needs of the market, then the economy will really grow.
And this is where I have a question for you, Jason.
Go for it.
So, while I was reading that Les Leopold article yesterday, I was thinking to myself, it's depressing to read that neoliberalism, these policies and practices, don't actually accomplish what its proponents claim. The idea that a deregulated financial sector will reinvest its wealth into our larger society through the creation of jobs, the maintenance of infrastructure, and the investment in our communities. What seems to be happening instead, at least in America, and for a majority of the time, almost universally even perhaps, is that the wealthy simply retain their wealth. If you frame this, I guess, this data, this information, from an ontological perspective, which is, as we've said before, the idea of how things come into being, how you sort of view the world, neoliberalism supports the idea that many people are naturally selfish creatures. And that's sort of as I said, a depressing and a dark outlook on humanity, and one that I don't wish to be true.
So the neoliberal ontology states that individuals are naturally selfish?
Well, that's what all this information suggests.
Oh, I got it. Yeah. I don't agree with that. I totally see what you're saying. Like, okay, so we've been told that the best way to run society is if we all just kind of act in our. So this is what Adam Smith wrote about, 1776, The Wealth of Nations. We talked about that in our last episode. If we leave it up to individuals to run society, they're going to operate in their own self-interests, which is actually fine, because if we all operate in our own self-interests, we'll be somehow making economic efficiency, which will help other people. The invisible hand of the market. this narrative, I can see how it would lead individuals to think that humans are naturally bad because, when we get wealth, we tend to hang on to wealth and not use much with it to help others. I tend to be an optimist. I think that humans are naturally good. And I think that we naturally want to live in a collective society where we can help other people and they can help us because that feels good. The problem with that sort of ontological point of view where it's like humans are naturally bad is that I think that you can't view human nature, whatever that is, in conjunction with like money, because money isn't actually a thing. Money isn't human nature. Money was a social construct that came after whatever you might call human nature. So it's hard to view the two together, I think, because human nature, I think, is kind of below money, and money can perhaps skew human nature and make sort of, sort of unhelpful thing. It can make humans do unhelpful things for other humans. It can so money is an incentive. Money can incentivize humans to do unhelpful things to other humans, but, ultimately I'm optimistic that that's not exactly true.
Sure. I would just clarify that I don't believe that the people who benefit the most from these sort of practices are necessarily evil or even bad people. But what they do is no less unjustifiable either, in my perspective. Yeah,
and that goes hand in hand, Matt. Like going back to the recent tax policy that was passed in 2017. The rhetoric behind that tax policy was that once we free up this money, and this was the same rhetoric when Reagan cut taxes in the 1980s, the rhetoric was that once we free up this money, it'll be redistributed to workers and laborers. And you saw like stories come out after that happened. A couple of like companies came out and said, yeah, now we're raising the minimum wage for our workers by $1. That was Walmart or something. And other companies saying we're going to give paid leave or whatever. And these stories, I was really skeptical of them because of my personal bias, but also, Trump came out and sort of tweeted about them and said, see, tax cuts great, so I'm a winner, or whatever he says, And what we've seen now, I think, objectively and unequivocally, is that companies have redistributed the wealth from their tax cuts back to their shareholders, back within their own stocks and dividends, not to their workers. And even I said last episode that Marco Rubio came out and made a statement about that. He's like, yeah, I think the problem with the tax cut is that companies have really just spent it on themselves, not their workers. And he walked back that a little bit after he said it because it's Marco Rubio. But, I think that is the fundamental problem where we keep being told or fed this rhetoric by people where it's like, let companies do what they need to do and it'll make everything better. If anything we've only seen the past 30 to 40 years is that when you leave companies to do what they want to do, companies will just look out for their wealthiest individuals. And that does not help you or me. That does not help their workers. It creates this toxic system where companies get more and more power to control our political system so that they can keep benefiting themselves. Like you said, Matt, it's a progressive feedback cycle. It makes itself worse over time. And I think we've seen that a lot. And we can go into Citizens United where companies and organizations can essentially be treated as they have the same First Amendment rights as individuals, and I think that's a real travesty for our society, and it's really dangerous because fundamentally what all of this is about is that inequality is dangerous for democracy. Inequality undermines social ties. Inequality makes it so that we trust each other less. Inequality makes it so that those who have more wealth and income can control the political and economic policies that allow them to get more wealth and income. Inequality produces segregation. Inequality produces unequal health outcomes. It produces unequal educational outcomes. Inequality is tied up with climate change and fights against environmental justice. Inequality is tied up with the prison industrial complex and how we've incarcerated 2 million Americans inside of prisons. It's all tied together inside of this larger theme, I think, where when you have a society that is run for the purpose of accumulating wealth through corporations, as opposed to using wealth to benefit collectively and publicly the people, you tend to get bad things that happen. And I think we're living through those times that we're seeing those things happen. And I think that, most folks would say that the way the system works is not working the way it should. And that's how you had, again, in 2016, both liberals and conservatives say that, the system is broken and it's not working for them. And I think that is so true. I think that both liberals and conservatives can legitimately say the system is broken. But the problem is that instead of viewing the problem as liberal versus conservative, we're not viewing we need to be viewing the problem as worker versus owner, financier versus laborer. So instead of liberal and conservative, we have to look at it as, do you only have your labor to sell? Or do you have financial assets, non-labor means of income and wealth? And the fundamental fact of it is that if you are someone who only has your labor to sell, you are not doing all that well, comparatively. We still live in the wealthiest country in the world, in the history of the world. But I think we're starting to see real scary cracks in the fissure where income and wealth inequality are undermining all of the institutions that the country is supposed to stand for. Because folks who have the luxury of not just having their income to sell, they are getting a lot more wealth and power.
I agree.
Yeah. So that's, there's a lot more to go into about that, but, I hope that we're starting to paint a picture, perhaps, of what neoliberalism is and how that manifests. And again, I guess I'm going to end with a point that will actually undermine our whole narrative. And I just want to say that...
undermine or define?
Undermine, yeah. So actually undermine our narrative. And I guess I want to say that, I don't know if this will be too out there, but neoliberalism is just a conceptual tool that we can use to define problems. So again, it becomes really easy to use words like globalization and neoliberalism and ontology and use them sort of willy-nilly, and they lose all their meaning. And that's the problem with, I think, human language, where we have to use these terms literally liberally so that they can help to construct this package. What I like about the term neoliberalism is that it is a word that we can use to put a sort of a wrapping paper on all of these problems. Again, the whole point of the show, folks, and the show description is that I hope that we are trying to create the vocabulary and the discourse necessary to define the problems that are happening in our society. And I think neoliberalism is a useful term. And if you're still leaving this being like, I'm not exactly sure what neoliberalism is, we'll keep coming back to it in future shows. And just remember that it is just it's a term that can hopefully be used to reference a sort of a manifestation of problems that are going on. And so it is subject to mutual debate and reconstruction at all times, just as all human language is. And ultimately, I think that's a good thing, and I hope that you take part in this debate and construct the vocabulary necessary to define our reality with us.